She never imagined her worth could be measured by something she could not control. Yet in her parents' eyes, she was defined by it. From the time she was a little girl, they whispered dreams of grandchildren, of carrying the family line forward, of pride that came from seeing tiny feet run across the yard. But when the truth settled in, when doctors' words confirmed what her body could not give, their love turned cold. Affection became distance, and disappointment grew sharper with every passing day. They did not see her kindness. They did not notice the way she sang softly while working, or how she cared for others with gentleness that came from the heart. All they saw was a woman they believed was broken, a daughter they thought had failed them. And in the world they lived in, failure was not tolerated, it was punished. The night it happened was not dramatic, not even loud. There were no arguments, no final pleas, only silence that felt heavier than shouting. Her parents sat across the table, eyes fixed not on her face but on the floor as though looking at her was too much. When they finally spoke, it was not about her dreams, her future, or her feelings. It was about a deal, a transaction, a decision made without her voice. She was to be sold. Her hands trembled as she listened, but her voice never found its strength. How could it? These were the people who were supposed to protect her, the ones who had held her as a child, who had promised her safety. Now they were the ones tearing that safety away. She was not being sent off to marry with love or choice. She was being exchanged, like an object passed from one set of hands to another. What hurt the most was not the loss of home, but the realization that, to them, she had never truly belonged. She was only a means to an end, a vessel for grandchildren that would never come. And once that hope vanished, so did their attachment. In that moment, the world she had trusted cracked wide open, leaving her standing in the center of it all, abandoned, unwanted, and utterly powerless to stop what was coming next. The journey away from her parents' home was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The air felt colder, the road longer, and the silence heavier than words could describe. She sat in the back of a wagon, her hands tied loosely, not because she might run, but because she no longer had the strength to resist. Each turn of the wheels was a reminder that she was leaving behind everything she had once called hers, though the cruel truth was that nothing had ever truly belonged to her, not even her life. Her parents had proven that when they decided she was worth more gone than staying under their roof. The men who escorted her did not speak kindly. They laughed with each other, spat into the dirt, and treated her as if she were invisible, except when they needed to bark an order. She kept her head down, her eyes fixed on the wooden boards of the wagon, trying to block out their words. Her body ached with the weight of despair, but deeper than that was the wound in her heart, the wound left by betrayal. It was not strangers who had stolen her freedom. It was the very people who had given her life. The road carried them farther from the town she knew, deeper into the wilderness where the trees grew taller, and the sound of axes striking wood echoed across the valleys. By the time the wagon stopped, night was falling, and she realized with a heavy heart that she had not been sold into another family, nor welcomed into a new home. She had been brought to be given away, traded to a man whose life none of them seemed to understand. When she finally looked up, she saw him for the first time. The lumberjack. He was taller than most men she had seen, his shoulders broad from years of splitting trees, his hands calloused, his face weathered by wind and work. He did not smile, nor did he scowl. His eyes, however, were different from the others, steady, calm, and unreadable. He stood with 4 children gathered around him, their faces half hidden in the shadows of dusk. They were quiet, their small hands clinging to his coat as if afraid the world might take him away. The men who had brought her stepped forward, coins exchanging hands in a way that made her stomach twist. They spoke in low voices, but she heard enough to know that her worth had been decided without her. Once the exchange was done, the men climbed back onto the wagon and left without so much as a glance in her direction. The sound of wheels fading into the distance marked the end of her old life and the beginning of something she could not yet name. For a long moment, no one moved. She stood in the dirt, The coat her mother had once stitched clinging loosely to her shoulders, her breath shallow in the cold night air. The lumberjack said nothing, his children still clinging to him, their eyes wide as they studied her. She felt like an intruder, as if she had stepped into someone else's world uninvited. Her mind raced with fear, suspicion, and exhaustion. Was she just another burden to him, another mouth to feed, another tool to use? At last he stepped forward. His boots crunched against the frozen ground, and when he reached her, he didn't grab her or drag her. Instead, he lifted the coat from his own shoulders and draped it over hers. It was heavy, smelling of pine and smoke, and though it offered warmth, she stiffened, unsure of his intentions. He spoke only one word, his voice deep and calm. "Come." The cabin they entered was small, built of rough logs, the roof patched with care. Inside, it was warm from the fire that burned in the hearth, the smell of wood smoke thick in the air. The children slipped inside quickly, their voices quiet but curious as they whispered to one another. She remained by the door, unsure if she was meant to step farther. The lumberjack busied himself with the fire, adding another log, the sparks crackling brightly in the dim room. He finally looked at her again, his gaze steady but not unkind. "You're safe here." The words rang strange in her ears. She had not heard the word safe in so long that it almost felt like a foreign language. Yet even as he said it, a part of her doubted. Safe for how long? Safe from what? Safe until someone else decided she was not worth keeping. The children soon gathered around her, timid at first, then bolder. A little girl tugged at the hem of her dress, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Are you staying?" she asked softly. The question pierced her heart in a way nothing else had. She did not know the answer. She could not promise anything, not to herself, not to them. That night, as she lay on a simple bed of furs and blankets, she stared at the ceiling of the cabin, listening to the soft breathing of the children in the next room and the steady creak of the wooden walls against the wind. The lumberjack sat by the fire, silent, watchful, a figure carved out of patience and strength. She did not know what he expected of her, nor what she was supposed to become in this strange place. What she did know was that her parents' rejection had cut her deeply, leaving scars she feared might never heal. And yet, in the quiet of that cabin, with the fire's glow casting light across the wooden beams, she felt something unfamiliar flicker in the darkness of her despair. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the faintest spark of possibility, that maybe, just maybe, this chapter of her life would not end the same way it had begun. The following days passed in a blur of silence and uncertainty. She woke each morning to the sound of the lumberjack chopping wood outside, the steady rhythm of his axe striking echoing through the valley like a heartbeat. The children moved about quietly, carrying out small chores with the discipline of those who had learned responsibility too young. They watched her with cautious eyes, whispering among themselves when they thought she wasn't listening. She tried to avoid their stares, keeping to herself, unsure of what role she now played in this household. At first, she believed he had taken her in as nothing more than another pair of hands. She expected harsh orders, endless labor, perhaps even cruelty disguised as necessity. But the days unfolded differently. He gave her no commands. When he spoke, his words were few and practical. "There's food on the table. The water is fresh. Rest if you need." He did not demand anything from her, nor did he treat her like a burden. It was this very absence of cruelty that unsettled her most. She had been traded like livestock, handed from one world to another without choice. Her mind braced for change she could not see, for expectations that would crush her spirit. Instead, she found space, a small cabin, yes, but one that did not cage her. She could step outside into the yard, feel the crunch of snow under her boots, breathe in the cold air. No one stopped her. No one shouted. It was freedom, yet it felt strange. She did not know what to do with it. The children began to approach her in small ways. The youngest, a boy no older than 5, would creep toward her while she was by the fire, holding out a wooden toy carved clumsily in the shape of a horse. His wide eyes searched her face as though testing whether she was safe. She would take it gently, nodding her thanks, and he would scurry back, cheeks flushed with shy pride. The eldest girl, perhaps 12, showed more boldness. One morning she placed a loaf of bread in front of her and said, "Papa made it, but I baked it." There was challenge in her tone, as if daring her to dismiss the effort. Instead, she broke a piece, tasted it, and said softly, "It's good." The girl's expression softened, a flicker of trust passing between them. Still, trust did not come easily to her. At night, when she lay beneath the heavy blankets, her mind returned to the home she had left behind. She saw her parents' faces, cold and unyielding, their decision to sell her carved deep into her memory. She remembered the shame of being told she was worthless, the sting of being measured by her body's ability to give children. Even here, in a place where no one spoke of such things, she carried the weight of that judgment. She wondered if the lumberjack thought the same, if behind his quiet demeanor he saw her as broken. But the more she observed him, the more she realized he was different. His life was built on work, on the steady rhythm of providing for 4 children who depended on him. He rose with the sun, felled trees with his bare strength, returned with logs stacked high, and still found the patience to sit by the fire at night with a child leaning against him. He did not complain, did not boast. His hands bore scars of years spent fighting the wilderness, yet those same hands never trembled when tying a child's shoe or brushing hair from a little forehead. One evening, she found herself watching him as he mended a torn coat by lantern light. His brow furrowed in concentration, his large fingers moving carefully with needle and thread. It struck her then how different he was from the men she had known before. He was not a man who sought to control or diminish. He was a man who endured. And though he did not speak of loneliness, she could see it in the way his eyes lingered on the fire too long, or how his shoulders seemed to sag when he thought no one was looking. It was the children who began to draw her out of her silence. One afternoon, when the youngest boy stumbled while playing and scraped his knee, he ran to her instead of his father. She froze at first, unsure of what to do. But when his small arms wrapped around her waist and his sobs shook against her, instinct took over. She knelt, wiped away his tears, and pressed a cloth to his wound. He clung to her as though she had always been there, as though she was already part of their world. The lumberjack stood in the doorway, watching quietly, saying nothing. Yet she could feel his gaze, heavy with something she could not name. After that, the children came to her more often. They asked her to tell stories by the fire, to braid hair, to help with lessons. Each request chipped away at the wall she had built around herself. Slowly, she began to laugh again, a sound that startled even her when it escaped her lips. The children smiled wider each time, as if they had been waiting for it all along. The lumberjack did not interfere, but she could sense his relief. His eyes softened when he saw her surrounded by the children, his jaw unclenched when he heard their laughter fill the cabin again. He never spoke of gratitude, never praised her directly, but she noticed the small things. The way he left a chair pulled close to the fire for her. The way he set aside the best portion of meat at dinner. The way his coat, once draped over her shoulders on that first night, always seemed to hang near the door in case she needed it again. Though doubt still lingered in her heart, though the scars of betrayal still ached, she began to feel something she had not dared to hope for. Belonging. It was fragile, uncertain, but it was real. For the first time since her parents had cast her aside, she felt that perhaps her worth was not tied to what she could or could not give. Perhaps, here in this cabin deep in the woods, surrounded by children who looked at her with trust and a man who did not demand but simply accepted, she might find a life that was truly her own. The snow outside thickened as winter tightened its grip on the valley. Each morning the cabin was wrapped in silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the soft shuffle of boots on wooden floors. The children had grown used to her presence, and their hesitation gave way to familiarity. They no longer whispered about her as though she were a stranger. Instead, they reached for her hand when walking across the icy yard, or sat close beside her when the wind howled too loudly against the shutters. With each passing day, the walls around her heart weakened. even though the memory of her parents' betrayal still burned like an ember she could not put out. She found herself waking earlier, rising before the sun to help prepare breakfast, kneading dough with fingers that remembered the motions from her childhood. The eldest girl, whose eyes had once studied her with suspicion, now hovered at her side, eager to learn, her voice breaking the silence with questions about how much flour to use or when the bread would rise. She answered with patience, surprised by the warmth that spread through her as the girl's face lit with pride at her guidance. It was not motherhood as she had once imagined, yet it was something just as real. The lumberjack noticed, though he said little. He returned each evening from the forest, his coat stiff with frost, his beard dusted white from the cold, and watched the cabin glow with more life than it had in years. The children's laughter, the smell of food, the sound of her voice reading aloud from an old book by lamplight. It was a home again, not just a shelter. His eyes often lingered on her, though he turned away when she caught his gaze, as if afraid she might see the truth in his silence. Yet for all the warmth within the cabin, the world outside remained harsh. Whispers had begun in the nearby town, carried by those who had witnessed her sale and those who delighted in cruel gossip. They spoke of the lumberjack as a fool, wasting his resources on a woman who could not give him more children. They muttered that she was cursed, that she brought shame to anyone who kept her. Though she did not hear the words directly, she felt their weight each time they traveled into the valley, carried by men passing through or by the glance of a trader who lingered too long. One afternoon, as she stood outside hanging damp clothes on a line strung between two poles, she heard hoofbeats approaching. Fear gripped her chest, for the sound of riders always stirred memories of the night she was taken from her home. She froze, clutching a shirt in her hands until the figures came into view. It was not her parents, nor strangers with cruel intent, but men from town, 3 of them, their expressions unreadable as they slowed near the cabin. The lumberjack stepped from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag, his stance straight and unflinching. The men exchanged words with him, too low for her to hear, but she could sense the tension in the air. One of them glanced her way, his mouth curling in a smirk that made her blood run cold. She turned quickly, gathering the clothes, forcing her hands to remain steady. When the men finally left, the lumberjack stood in the yard longer than necessary, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning the horizon as though he expected trouble to return. That night he kept his rifle closer than usual, and she realized he carried not only the burden of his children's safety but hers as well. Despite the unease, life inside the cabin continued. She found comfort in small routines, the warmth of the fire on her hands, the hum of a lullaby as she tucked the younger ones into bed, the sight of snowflakes drifting past the window like feathers. The children came to her for advice, for comfort, for love they did not even realize they craved. Each time she offered it, a part of her healed. She had been told she was worthless, yet here she was, shaping lives with kindness that no one could measure. The lumberjack, too, began to show signs of change. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep, he remained by the fire instead of retreating to his room. He sat across from her, the flames casting shadows across his worn face. For a long while neither spoke. The silence was not heavy but filled with the unspoken weight of 2 lives reshaping themselves. Finally he said, "You've given them something I could not." His voice was low, roughened by years of solitude, but sincere. She shook her head, her instinct to deny the words. "They're your children, you've given them everything." He met her eyes, steady and unyielding. "I've kept them alive. You've made them feel alive." The words struck deep, stirring emotions she had tried to bury. She looked away, her throat tight, unsure how to answer. But in that moment she understood something she had not dared to believe. He saw her not as a burden, not as broken, but as someone who mattered. Still, doubts haunted her. At night, when the house was quiet, she thought of her parents. She wondered if they ever regretted what they had done, if they ever spoke her name aloud, or if they had erased her completely. She questioned whether she had the right to feel happiness when the wound of betrayal still bled within her. Yet when she saw the children's faces each morning, when their arms wrapped around her waist and their laughter filled the cabin, she knew she could not let the past steal the present. The lumberjack never pressed her to forget. He never spoke of her parents, never asked questions she was not ready to answer. Instead, he offered her the one thing no one else ever had: patience. And with each passing day, she began to believe that maybe her worth was not tied to what had been taken from her, but to what she still had to give. Spring came slowly to the valley, the snow melting into rivulets that carved paths through the earth, feeding streams that swelled with new life. The forest grew greener, birds returned to their nests, and the cabin seemed to breathe easier with the change of season. Yet beneath the promise of warmth, unease lingered. She had begun to settle into the rhythm of her days, but whispers from the town still traveled to them like shadows stretching across the land. And each time the lumberjack returned from market, his eyes carried the weight of words he would not speak. She tried not to ask, but the silence said enough. People still remembered the way she had been cast aside, the way she had been sold. They did not see her as a woman rebuilding her life, but as damaged, as a burden undeserving of respect. It cut her, though she pretended not to hear. At night, when the house was quiet, she sometimes lay awake, the voices echoing in her mind, reminding her of the cruel judgment she had never asked for. But in the daylight, the children's laughter pulled her back from the edge. They had grown to depend on her, not out of duty, but out of love. The youngest boy would climb into her lap without hesitation, resting his head against her chest as if he had always belonged there. The eldest girl, once guarded, now sought her advice for everything: how to sew a straight line, how to calm the little ones when storms rattled the windows. She answered patiently, often smiling at the thought that she was trusted in ways she had once believed impossible. The lumberjack watched these moments from a quiet distance. He did not intrude, but his presence was steady, like the trees that stood tall around the cabin. Sometimes, when she looked up and caught his gaze, she saw something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. It was not pity. It was not obligation. It was recognition, a quiet acknowledgement of the bond growing between them, one that neither had spoken of but both felt in the silence between words. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, she lingered by the fire, the flickering light painting her face in warm gold. He was at the table, sharpening a blade, his movements slow and deliberate. The air between them was filled with the crackle of flames and the faint howl of wind outside. She found herself speaking before she realized the words had formed. "Do you ever wonder if they'll come back?" He looked up, the knife paused in his hands. "Your parents?" She hesitated, then nodded. Her throat tightened as the memory rose again, the look on their faces when they cast her aside, the way they refused to meet her eyes as they sold her to strangers. He set the knife down, leaning back in his chair. His voice was calm, steady. "If they do, they'll find you're not the same woman they left behind." The words should have comforted her, yet they stirred a storm inside. She wanted to believe she was stronger, that the love she found here had rebuilt what was broken. But the scars of betrayal still burned, and part of her feared the past would always haunt her. She turned her gaze to the fire, her hands tightening in her lap. Days later, as she walked with the children to the stream that ran behind the cabin, she heard the distant echo of horses. Her heart leapt in her chest, her breath catching. The children noticed her sudden stillness, their voices fading into silence as they, too, heard the sound. Riders. She pulled them close, her eyes scanning the tree line, fear gripping her like a vice. But the riders passed at a distance, their faces unseen, leaving only dust in the air. Still, the fear lingered long after they had gone. That night she confessed her worry to him. "I don't want to be taken again." The words slipped out, raw and trembling. He crossed the room, stopping just a step away from her. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of promise. "No one will take you from here. Not while I stand." She believed him, not because he was a man of many words, but because every action of his life had proven he meant what he said. He had built his world on strength and loyalty, and though he was not one to speak of love openly, His protection was its own kind of vow. The days grew longer, and with them came moments she never expected. She laughed more, her voice carrying across the yard as the children chased each other through the tall grass. She found herself humming while she worked, the simple melodies filling the cabin with warmth. And sometimes, when the lumberjack returned from the forest, she met him at the door with a smile she did not try to hide. But joy was never free of shadow. One evening, as she gathered water at the well, she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, startled, only to find a man from town leaning against the fence, his eyes sharp and mocking. "So it's true," he sneered. "The lumberjack keeps what others throw away." The words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. She stood frozen, the bucket heavy in her hands, until the man tipped his hat and walked away, leaving only the sting of his cruelty. She carried the water inside, her face pale, her heart pounding. She said nothing, but the lumberjack noticed. He always noticed. That night he sat beside her by the fire, his voice low. "You are not what they say." She shook her head, unable to answer, her throat tight with unshed tears. But he leaned closer, his words steady, unshakable. "You're more than they could ever see. Don't let their blindness steal your worth." For a moment she let herself believe him. She leaned back in the chair, closing her eyes, listening to the fire's crackle and the sound of his breathing nearby. And though the doubts would return, though the whispers of the world would always linger, in that moment she felt something she had thought lost forever. She felt wanted, not for what she could give, but for who she already was. Summer arrived with long days and the scent of pine hanging heavy in the air. The forest was alive with the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves, while the cabin yard filled with the sound of children's laughter as they played barefoot in the grass. She watched them often, her heart softening at the sight. The little ones clung to her skirts when they tired, their hands sticky from berries, their eyes shining with joy. The eldest helped her hang linens on the line, their conversations flowing more easily now, no longer guarded. She had grown into a figure the children leaned on, a source of comfort and stability they had once only found in their father. Still, shadows lingered. Though her days were brighter, she could never fully shake the memory of her parents' rejection. Sometimes, in the quiet of night, she woke with tears she didn't understand, dreams of standing again in that cold room where their eyes turned away from her. She wondered if she would ever be free of it or if betrayal lived forever in the heart. The lumberjack never pressed her to share these thoughts, but he knew. His silence was not ignorance, it was respect. He sat by the fire when she stirred from her sleep, his presence steady, reminding her she was not alone. One afternoon, as she walked along the stream with the children, gathering wildflowers, a rider appeared on the ridge. The sight of the horse and dust made her breath catch, memories crashing over her like a wave. She pulled the children close until the figure came into focus. It was only a trader passing through, his eyes tired, his horse thin. Relief washed over her, but her hands trembled long after he was gone. She realized then that fear would always return in unexpected moments, and healing was not a straight path. The lumberjack noticed her unease when they returned. He set aside his axe, wiped the sweat from his brow, and met her eyes with a quiet question. She only shook her head, unable to speak of the storm inside. He did not push. Instead, that evening, he placed his chair closer to hers by the fire, the space between them shrinking in a way that felt deliberate, protective, and strangely comforting. As weeks passed, the bond between them deepened in ways neither openly acknowledged. She found herself listening for his footsteps when he returned from the woods, her heart easing only when he stepped through the door. She noticed the way his children watched him with trust, and slowly she began to share in that trust herself. He was not a man of many words, but every action spoke clearly. The food he left for her, the tools he mended without being asked, the way his eyes softened when she comforted one of his children. Yet whispers from the outside world had not vanished. Traders brought news from town, speaking carelessly of her past, mocking what they did not understand. One evening, when a careless word reached her ears, she left the table abruptly, her chest tight, her breath uneven. She stepped outside into the fading light, the cool air brushing her face as she fought to hold herself together. The lumberjack followed, his boots crunching softly against the dirt. For a long moment he stood beside her in silence, watching the sun dip behind the mountains. Finally he spoke, his voice low and firm. "You don't owe them anything. Not your pain, not your worth. They didn't see you, but I do." She turned to him, her eyes filled with tears she could no longer hold back. His gaze did not waver. It was steady, anchored, and in it she saw no judgment, only truth. She had been unwanted once, discarded like she was nothing, yet here was a man who saw her as more than the scars she carried. For the first time in her life, she felt the strength of being chosen, not out of duty, not out of pity, but out of quiet recognition. From that moment, something within her shifted. She began to stand straighter, her steps firmer. She no longer flinched when strangers passed too close. She still remembered the cruelty of her parents, but it no longer defined her. The children sensed the change as well. They clung less out of fear and more out of love, their laughter brighter, their trust deeper. Even the eldest, once so cautious, now sought her out for advice with a softness that spoke of respect. One day, while the sun was high and the forest hummed with life, she sat on the porch, mending clothes. The lumberjack returned from the woods, his arms stacked with logs, his shirt damp with sweat. The children rushed to him, their voices rising with joy. She looked up, watching the scene unfold, and for the first time her heart did not ache with the reminder of what she had lost. Instead, it swelled with the recognition of what she had gained. A home, a place, a family. When he finally met her gaze across the yard, there was no need for words. The truth was there in the silence they shared, as steady and enduring as the mountains that surrounded them. She had been sold because others saw no value in her. But here, in this place, with him and the children, she had found a life no one could take away. And though the road that had brought her here was marked by pain, it had led her to something stronger than she had ever dreamed possible: belonging.